Good evening. Welcome to our Bible study tonight. Tonight we're going to talk about the person of Hosea in the Old Testament, and this really is one of my very favorite stories in all of the Bible. You know, the book of Hosea is not about one verse that jumps out, it's a story. It's a person's life story that is just almost unbelievable to tell, not because of some big heroic act, not because of some big miracle, but because of an incredible amount of compassion that this man had for the woman that he loved. It really is so reflective of how we can trust the Bible because it is it's not full of these mythical characters. It is full of these people who partnered with God in order to do his work and made a difference in people's lives. And it is no mistake that this story of compassion and love made it to the Old Testament. We are continuing our series of Glad Reunion, Dr. Claypool's book about reacquainting us with people from the Old Testament. And these stories are just so relevant today. What could be more relevant to what our world needs right now than more compassion and love for each other? Well, he begins by saying that a person without a memory is only half a person. Amnesia is a sickness, not an asset. And that's one of my favorite things to say, as a student and teacher of history, that if we forget where we come from, we continue to make the same mistakes over and over again. He says this is to help us understand who we are as people of God, by recalling the long memory of his people as recorded in the Old Testament. This is our religious heritage, us being reminded of who we are as people of God. Well, Hosea is a heroic figure. He was the courage, he had the most courage and possibly the most compassion of anyone in the Old Testament, but it is not out of some big miracle. It is out of a personal tragedy in his life, what he describes as the most intimate sort. Hosea lived in the northern part of Israel in the last half of the 8th century. This is after the Israelis had been defeated and were in exile, so the morale of the nation was just as low as it could be. He says it was something much closer to home, to be more exact. It was that this story is not about the story of all the people at the time. It was Hosea's story, his own personal story, that proved to be so decisive for his life of ministry. Well, Hosea married a woman named Gomer. May have been his first mistake. Falling for a woman named Gomer, wouldn't call that the most romantic thing, but this was the beginning, and at first, as in so many relationships, everything went well. Through their first child, her name, was a son named Jezreel, and then when the second child was born, Hosea named her Lo-ruhamah, and that scholars translate as "she that never knew a father's love." So what that means is this is the writer telling us that this probably was not Hosea's child. And then the third child came along, Lo-ami, and that is translated as "not my people" or "no kin of mine." So that was reflective that, this woman had cheated on him and had two children that were not his. And then, to add insult to injury, she leaves him with these three kids, two of which were not his. You can imagine how disappointed he was. As a husband, he was rejected as a husband. He was humiliated in the eyes of his community. But to his credit, he was able to survive. So three great truths come out of this. The first is that it began to dawn on Hosea that God understood exactly what he was going through, because the Lord had been through the same kind of trauma with Israel. God chose Israel to be the the chosen people, the ones that he loved, and they continue to go out and worship other gods. So that began to dawn on him that they had this in common. Why was it that God chose the Israeli people? Why them? Why not the Assyrians? Why not the Phoenicians? Why not the Egyptians? And he says it could be no more explained rationally than why any two people can tell why they fell in love. He says, what did Jesus say was the first and greatest of all commandments? It is not, you shall respect the Lord your God or even serve your God. It is rather, you shall love the Lord your God with all of your being. And how is this possible? Because he first loved us. So he says Hosea's vision of the relationship between God and humankind is that at bottom, sin means violating a gracious trust, breaking faith with the one who loves us the way that Gomer broke faith with Hosea. Isn't that just an amazing insight? He said the second insight had to do with the relation of knowledge or the lack of it to human sinfulness. Why would Gomer do what she did in leaving a good husband and a family for the life of a prostitute? Or at a deeper level, why would Israel desert God and worship these other idols? He says the answer Hosea came to is the same that Jesus articulated from the cross when he prayed, Father, forgive them. They have no idea what they're doing. He says, we do not know the things that make for our peace, as Jesus put it, and so we perished for the lack of pragmatic knowledge about what really works for our own good. He says this is a theme Hosea underlines again and again in his book, blaming prophets and priests alike for not learning what God has been trying to teach them from the very beginning. And he says this is where our problem lies. We refuse to be taught about who God really is. This is my very favorite way to put it. Comes very much out of the story of the prodigal son. God will allow us to learn on our own what we refuse to be taught. Think about that. God wants to teach us. God wants us to know, but he will not force it on us. God will allow us to learn on our own what we refuse to be taught. That is what is at the bottom of it, not God's willingness to teach, our unwillingness to learn. The last insight, he says, that came to Hosea is perhaps the most moving of all, for it is in sharing with God and in the identity of agony he had come to feel with God, he caught a glimpse of the Holy One's deepest nature into how the One was responding to the way Israel had retreated him. He says, Israel must learn by her own suffering what it is she had done. There will be calamity and defeat and exile, Hosea says, but that's not all. God still loves Israel, even though she has not loved him. And out there in the desert of exile, the Holy One vows to bring them back once again and to win their affection. There is hope in the heart of the aggrieved. You know, it's really amazing how this story ends, because it could end there. So many books in the Old Testament of the prophets, they just end with this, kind of vague hope. But what happens next in this story is nothing short of amazing. It does end with great insight, but not just that insight. After years of having been rejected by this woman that he loved, he still loved her and still had hope for her. And then he saw her being sold as a slave. What does he do? Here's the woman who is the mother of his first child, who had two other children from men, she had two other children that weren't his. He had raised them, and now he sees her being sold as a slave. What does he do? Hosea went and got 15 shekels of silver and a half of barley. That's what was a slave's ration. And laying it at the feet of the slave trader, the feet of the slave trader, he pointed to Gomer and said, I want her. Now, we assume that she just went with him and they lived happily ever after, but we're not told. We're not told how that story ended. And I think that is intentional. He says it this way: perhaps the issue is left open for a reason, to underline the fact, for all its power, love is not absolute. By its very nature, it will not coerce or force. And that is the final terror of life. God is love, not just power, which means he will not bludgeon us into the kingdom against our will. He will persuade us. He will forgive us, do all that can be done. But the response is ultimately left to us. If we will not accept his love, he will take our no for an answer, and that is why there is a hell. God will not force us into the light. So we don't know what Gomer did, but that's not really the most important question. The most important question is, what will you do? How will we respond to the God who says, I made you and I love you, and now I have bought you? Will you share life with me forever? Really an amazing story with great insight. And there is hope, but it is ultimately left to us. Love, by its very nature, does not coerce. God is not going to make us do anything, but he will always be there waiting. God bless you until we meet again.